Hey, what's good? It's your boy Mixtape Mobb, and today I'm going to do a review of the classic Mobb Deep album, The Infamous, which turned 25 years old this past week. Let's get to it. Mobb Deep is a legendary Queens, New York rap duo that emerged on the scene in the early 90s. Mobb Deep consists of Havoc, who is also an esteemed producer, and of course, the late great Prodigy. Havoc comes from the notorious Queensbridge housing projects, which is also the birthplace for rap legends such as Nas, Marley Marl, and MC Shan, while Prodigy hailed from the deserts of Hempstead, Long Island. Queens would later become his home. The duo released their debut album, Juvenile Hell, in 1993. While the album featured a beat from DJ Premier and Large Professor, it did little to differentiate the two from other kid rappers at the time, i.e. Shaheem and the Youngsters. As a result, they were unfortunately dropped from their label and forced to reinvent themselves. However, their second studio album, which was of course The Infamous, was the one album that changed everything and quickly catapulted them to the top layer of hardcore East Coast hip hop. This was basically their reintroduction and a second chance to prove themselves after their lackluster debut. This project was released on April 25th, 1995 on Loud Records. There are a couple significant points to this album that I think make it stand out a little more than other very good mid-90s New York albums, because you had quite a few iconic releases at this time that could be considered classics or East Coast classics in their own right. Albums like J. Rue the Damages, The Sun Rises in the East, AZ's Do or Die, Smith & Wesson's The Shining, and Capone Noriega's War Report, just to name a few. However, the first thing is that this album represented a shift in East Coast production sounds from the more fast-paced and jazzy-inspired instrumentals to a much darker, more soul-based style of production with rugged bass lines and eerie piano melodies. The second thing that this album did was set a lyrical precedent for other East Coast artists to follow. It required them to be a little more serious with their tone, to improve their storytelling, and to really explore the darker and more graphic aspects of street life. This album is bursting with quotable lines and lyrics that almost serve as a guide or survival manual for growing up in a tough environment. It's really impressive when you consider that Hav and P were just 18 to 19 years of age when this was created. They were indeed wise and insightful beyond their years. Perhaps this was due to their Queens education, and I'm not exactly referring to public school. As a duo, Havoc and Prodigy really enhanced or added on to the level of Queensbridge slang and reality rap that Nas introduced to the world just 1 year before with Illmatic. Now, obviously, Nas was not the first East Coast artist to do this. Rap veterans Cool G Rap and Rakim had been rhyming about more serious and gritty content since the 80s and well into the early 90s. However, they were from a different generation than the young Nas, Havoc, and P. And not to compare The Infamous to Illmatic, because it's ultimately a group project, but the raw street poeticism found on Illmatic is in full abundance on The Infamous also. While Nas did rap about some cutthroat survival themes on records like New York State of Mind and Represent, Havoc and Prodigy devoted this whole album to such gritty and graphic depictions of urban life. Lyrically, this project is just as dark as its production. The listener doesn't get much of a reprieve from the very grim storytelling and heavy street vignettes. As teenagers, Havoc and Prodigy were still trying to make their way out of the belly of Queens, New York, and every rhyme on this album seemed to embody this survivalist mentality. Yet, I suppose you could also label their outlook as somewhat fatalistic at times, especially on records like The Start of Your Ending and Cradle to the Grave. But at the end of the day, whether they were issuing stern warnings to rival crews or reporting on the warlike conditions in Queensbridge, they were able to pull the listener into their world in a very cinematic way. However, the lyrical motion picture that they created didn't necessarily glamorize the street lifestyle, as many hip hop albums and gangster movies would do. Instead, the pictures that Have and P illustrated were often grim and not for the faint of heart. So if you happen to be a straight up shook one, then you probably couldn't relate. In terms of the production, the bulk of the Infamous was produced by Havoc. He did all of the songs except for Give Up the Goods, Temperatures Rising, and Drink Away the Pain. These were, of course, handled by Q-Tip of A Tribe Called Quest fame. And Q-Tip needs to get all of his props and flowers for guiding the young Have and P through the whole album process. It's safe to say that his sonic imprint was felt throughout this album. The selection of beats were definitively mid-90s New York in sound. In 1995, Mobb Deep's production style seemed to best reflect New York's distinct regional sound at the time. This unmistakable East Coast production made you feel like you were up close and personal dwelling on a park bench in Queensbridge. The majority of these beats have hard-hitting drums, mainly dirty snares and rugged bass lines. It was almost like if you mixed traditional jazzy boom bap with some very off-kilter and distorted RZA sounding production. That was the lo-fi and dingy basement sound that Havoc was able to cook up on this album. And I also think these dark and ominous instrumentals were the perfect backdrop to represent the lifestyle that Have and P were still living, because they were still residing in the projects where shit wasn't sweet, and their music seemed to symbolize this struggle. The instrumental on the opening track, The Start of Your Ending, almost feels like a heavy gray cloud hovering over the Queensbridge houses. Despite this misty production, the duo instantly grab your attention. There is some boasting and cautioning of fake crews. Prodigy even speaks on stomping competitors out with a pair of black Tims. The infamous prelude serves as proof that the young Prodigy was ready for whatever the streets or the rap industry would bring. This is a classic shit-talking interlude, which could have easily been the result of too much Hennessy. Later in his rant, he actually dissed the rap crew Def Squad for what he labeled as that crazy space shit that don't make no sense. This segues nicely into the single Survival of the Fittest. Prodigy opens with the memorable "There's a war going on outside no man is safe from. You can run but you can't hide forever." This is probably one of the group's most infamous quotes. I also thought there was something about the eerie piano loop that gave me strong RZA vibes. This track embodies the hustling and perseverance mentality that I think many can relate to, whether you are coming of age, handling your business in the streets or in the corporate world, or whatever your story is. And in Mobb Deep's case, it speaks to the realities that many black youth and people of color face regularly, and that is the mindset of survival. An Eye for an Eye is one of the greatest New York posse cuts of all time. This features a pinnacle Nas verse as well as a vivid performance from Raekwon the Chef. The overall sound here just personifies the murky and shadowy underworld of NYC in the mid-90s. Prodigy cleverly states, "I might crack a smile, but ain't a damn thing funny." It's such an iconic line that I often find myself to this day repeating it, especially when I'm trying to be witty yet serious at the same damn time. Nas provides some really descriptive imagery with Thug dressed like a gentleman. This always struck me as clever because thugs do not have to dress or look a certain way. And if you are truly wise to the game, then you will realize that you can't underestimate anyone. Raekwon adds to the overall grimy feel with lines like, "But late night, candlelight fiend with a crack pipe." It's very cinematic and haunting. I thought the crackling record sound throughout made this track also more dirty and dusty. The Just Step interlude introduces the world to Big Noyd, and he comes away with some memorable acapella bars with, "Sometimes I wish I had 3 different faces. I'm going to court for 3 cases in 3 places." This transitions into the Q-Tip produced Give Up the Goods. I feel this beat is the perfect combination of rugged yet smooth. Although the instrumental is hard-hitting, Q-Tip managed to give it a crispy and polished feel, kind of like when you have a fresh lineup. Prodigy urgently opens with, "Ayo, Queens, get the money, long time no cash. I'm caught up in the hustle where the guns go blast." Big Noid comes through and steals the show with his hunger and tenacity. Havoc's "Ain't No Time for Faking Jack's" line is pretty iconic and has been sampled quite a bit over time. I'd consider this track to be the album's centerpiece in terms of the top-notch production and also the Mobb's elite street raps. This is followed up by Temperatures Rising, which is another Q-Tip production, so you were getting more of this underground yet refined style of instrumentation. I was always a fan of the drums on this track. It just made you feel like you were in a grimy and dimly lit basement session. This track is a thoughtful ode to Havoc's brother Killa Black, who was on the run at the time. It's got some great storytelling as well as some nice bluesy vocals from Crystal Johnson. It's one of the more warm and soulful cuts on the album, but it's not what I would exactly call lighthearted either. Sonically, this soul-based production continues with Up North Trip. This record deals with the anxiety of getting locked up and going upstate. It offers some gems on how to stay on point so that you don't get caught slipping. Trife Life opens with a really dreamy sample flip from Norman Connor's "You Are My Starship." This features some really detailed storytelling about how Hav and P got set up while visiting a girl's crib. This is, again, yet another one of the cautionary tales that are so pervasive throughout this LP. The theme here is to keep your head on a swivel and to be aware of your surroundings. It's almost like these tracks can be looked at as some form of mental fitness or training that prepares us for the harshness of life scenarios. The track QU Hectic opens with shouting from a rival crew talking down on Queens. It really adds a thick layer of tension before this ominous beat kicks in. This record reflects how Hav and P had to adapt to ruthlessness in order to survive or just to make a dollar on the streets of New York. This is followed up by the rugged and minimalistic Right Back At You. It's another posse cut with Big Noid and Ray, but this time featuring Ghostface. Stylistically, it almost has a demo-like quality, which gives it a rough aesthetic. Despite the strong woo features, I was always the most impressed by Havoc's verse. I think this was one of his more standout lyrical performances on the LP. The Grave Prelude paints a cinematic scene of a crew member getting shot on the street while the rain is pouring. This transitions into the very grim and anti-snitch record Cradle to the Grave. The production is once again very stripped back to what appears to be just an eerie bass line, but the storytelling is very vivid and movie-like. It's easily one of the more haunting and intense tracks. Drink Away the Pain offers a breather from the darkness to a jazzier and upbeat production sound courtesy of Q-Tip. He also has a guest verse. This is a very wordplay driven and heavy metaphor track. I thought it was clever how Hav and P compared their alcoholic consumption to their affection for various women. That brings us to their magnum opus, Shook Ones Part 2, which will go down as one of the greatest hip-hop records of all time. I mean, it's right up there with Wu-Tang's Cream and Rakim's Paid in Full. From the obscure sample flip that Havoc so expertly crafted to the endless quotables, it's really hip-hop excellence. I also think it's one of the darkest and most unlikely tracks to become a commercial hit in hip-hop, perhaps next to maybe Scarface's I Seen a Man Die. The album concludes with Party Over. The drums are pretty hard-hitting, giving it a raw and aggressive boom-bap feel, but I think the Miles Davis sample also gives it kind of a mesmerizing quality. It's a fun record that almost feels like a freestyle, but don't get it twisted. It's still consistent with the griminess and brutality throughout the project, as Hav and P, as well as the infamous Mobb, issue a series of threats. Because this was the 25th anniversary issue, Havoc decided to tack on 3 unreleased tracks from around the time of the infamous recording sessions. However, most of these songs have already been heard before by hardcore Mobb Deep fans. The original Shook Ones Part 1 has probably been floating around since the late 90s, I'd imagine, but if you never heard it, then it's definitely an important addition to this track list. While that particular beat is nowhere near as fantastic as Part 2, it's still a very solid and murky instrumental that gives some context to the time period in which it was created. I do know the track The Money version 2 appeared on the second disc of their infamous Mobb Deep album from 2014, but I didn't recall hearing the lifestyles of the infamous until now. On this track, Prodigy definitely went off in a very confident yet controlled freestyle flow over this stripped down beat. It's the essence of a raw and uncut product. So as I mentioned earlier, this album set a precedent and raised the bar for what was expected from East Coast artists who made hardcore hip hop. A lot of the slang and street level mantras that are still used today in hip hop can be traced back to this album. It's a soundtrack to the streets that captures the essence of two young artists who use their musical talents to make it up out of the struggle. If you want an album that symbolizes the core of intelligent and philosophical gangster rap, then look no further than the infamous. Please leave your thoughts below on this 25-year-old classic album. What were some of your favorite moments or favorite tracks? It's your boy Mixtape Mobb. I'm signing out. As always, it's peace and blessings, but be sure to hit the like button and please subscribe. Mobb Deep, the infamous 25th anniversary, 1.